Forgot to mute the recording. Okay. Anyway, thank you for coming today to the La Posta Road property owners meeting regarding the sewer alignment study. I'd like to remind you all that this is the first draft you're getting to see. There is a link here on this page that you may copy and paste in your web browser, and you're able to follow along on the documents as Paul is speaking to them. However, they will be posted on the page here as well. Please know that we will take questions at the end of the presentation because some of the questions we have received will be addressed throughout the presentation. If you prefer to ask your question verbally, please type your name in the chat, and as soon as we open it up for questions, we will start going down the line. We will unmute you in order to ask your question. And please know that the Alliance role is just to facilitate this meeting. We are not an expert in this subject matter. On this page, you will see it again at the end of this presentation, is the entire committee that has worked on this, this subject matter, and SEH Russell Engineering, their staff, who has also put this draft together. This whole slide deck will be put on the Yes LPC website, and you're able to gain all the access to every slide that's in this deck. That'll be put on when we put the recording on, and it will be on the La Posta Road link that you will find. Again, our website is yeslpc.com. With that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Paul O'Neill, engineer with SEH Russell Engineering.
Thanks, Emily. Like Emily said, I'm Paul O'Neill. Also from SEH are Mike Russell and Andy Arnold. They're both on the line here and will be speaking at some point during this presentation. Also have the county, city, and La Plata County Economic Development Alliance staff on here too. And I imagine we'll all be talking at some point during this. So the Posta Road Sewer Plan, we were contracted by the Economic Development Alliance in February to prepare a sewer study for the La Posta Road area. The goals of this project as part of that RFP were to evaluate potential sewer alignments, develop conceptual cost estimates, use that information to size the sewer capacity as far as lift stations, pipeline sizes, and phases, which were used to develop those cost estimates. Go through some of the operational considerations with South Durango, whether that be becoming a member of the district or a sub-district. After this, we will be developing 30% conceptual plans for submittal with this project, as well as a final summary report, which will go into some of the financing and funding options, as well as a future tribal connection, which has been evaluated as well. The Southern Ute Indian Tribe has land south of here that we looked at as part of this project. The proposed sewer system alignments, we've developed conceptual alignments to serve this area. You can consider these as trunk lines or main lines. There will be additional lines that feed into this system. So we've just looked at kind of the main trunk lines to serve a majority of this area by gravity as much as possible, and where needed, lift stations and force mains, which take the sewer that we can't get to the main lift station. They then pump it up to the main lift station so that we can send it to the South Durango Sanitation District plant. We developed phases to kind of break this project into reasonable chunks. By no means are these set in stone. They are our attempt at coming up with a reasonable phase based on properties as well as location and relation to the gravity or lift station system. At this point, I'm going to try to switch to some of these alignments to just go through them briefly. The files were a little too large to attach to the PowerPoint presentation. Here's kind of the overall site. Being on this call, I'm sure you're all familiar with this area, but this is kind of the overall study area. Most of it is in the La Posta area here. This portion was added to evaluate the potential future inclusion of the Southern Ute Indian tribal land in the event that they elect to develop and or connect to this system. Here is a phasing map, which kind of shows the different phases that we've broken out so far. Phase 1 here in green would be the initial lift station and river crossing to get sewer to the east side of the river where it could be treated by South Durango. Phase 2A and 2B, the reason we went with 2A and 2B was either of those phases could come next sequentially, depending on where development or people want service first. Either of those could be developed next, and those aren't interrelated. The phase 3, 4, and 5, and then phase 6, the tribal portion, would all be dependent somewhat on the preceding phase number in order to work the way we have the system laid out. Alternate 1 and 2 are attempts to impact certain properties less, depending upon the steps of the phasing. Alternate 1 is a phase 2B, alternate 1, excuse me, is a option which would allow portions of phase 2B and phase 3 and or 4 to develop without drastically impacting the properties that it's crossing there, where alternate 2 would kind of work with those properties a little bit better, but would need to be designed and built according to their plans ahead of time. Phase 3 is kind of the southern property area. Phase 4 is the Animas Air Park. There are 2 alternatives there as well. We tried to look at an alternative for phase 4 that could get service without phase 3, and phase 4 alternate 2 does that. It does not feed the entire Animas Air Park, as you'll see later, but it gets a good portion of it by using gravity service. And then phase 5 is a small version along the Posta Road, and then phase 6 is the tribal portion. Here's just kind of the properties that would be assigned to those phases. I'm going to go kind of briefly through these next plan and profile drawings. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time. They can get a little boring. But if people have questions at the end, we can bring these back up and look at them in a little bit more detail. Phase 1, lift station located near the well pad. It was brought up that this would be desirable as no one necessarily wants to live right next to a lift station and no one wants to live next to a gas well, so we put them next to each other. Profile shows the sewer getting underneath the river and then tying into the South Durango main, which runs down this road here. Phase 2A would be kind of serving the northern Moose Lane, Trestle Lane, or not Trestle Lane, Casey Lane areas and its corresponding profile. With this portion of the development being north, it's fairly easy to get gravity flow down to that lift station as things generally flow a little bit west to east and north to south. Phase 2B, alternate 1, this would be along the property line between the Jackrabbit properties and the Carter properties. We would need to get an easement either from all the Jackrabbit owners or just the Carter properties, and this would be an alternative that does not impact these properties as much with a future development plan. The issue is the topography of those hills. Phase 2B, alternate 2 is works a little bit more with the topography and could potentially be used by those properties as the trunk line connection. However, if these properties aren't ready to develop, the other alternative could be used ahead of time. This is Scott Fab's property, and they have a conceptual alignment of roads that we added here to correspond to their plans for development. Phase 3 runs down along the property lines between the two properties here that splits up Jackrabbit kind of from La Posta, flows down by gravity to a lift station that would be down here. So a gravity main would be installed along with a force main at the same time to then pump back up to get into the 2B gravity system. Phase 4 serves the Animas Air Park, if that's desirable. Currently, they are on septic systems, but in order to potentially expand and provide additional density up there, they would need to most likely join the South Durango sewer system. The air park generally drains north to south, so this has the ability to capture everything by gravity. We additionally looked at alternative 2 so that we could connect in earlier rather than waiting for the phase 3 lift station. However, we cannot serve everything by gravity because we are fighting grade here. And you can see that on this profile that we start to fight grade too much, that that's as far south as we can get with that system and meeting South Durango maximum depths of sewer manholes. Phase 5 seems unlikely early on, but as things develop and additional density becomes an option, this could be kind of a redevelopment of these parcels to more density. So we wanted to put it in and get a cost for it. And then phase 6 is the force main for the Southern Ute Indian Tribe. The Southern Ute Indian Tribe would have their own gravity collection system that would feed a proposed lift station, and then that lift station would have a force main that runs up La Posta Road and ties into phase 4 of the options I just went through. I'm going to jump back over to PowerPoint. Let's see if I can, pick up where I left off. So as part of that study, a good portion of that is to come up with quantities and cost estimates for this project. So you can see here the varying costs associated with each phase for the sewer system improvements. It is pretty expensive, as anyone in development knows that these things add up fairly quickly. Potential sizing and sewer flows, we used this to develop kind of the potential density for lift station pump sizing, as well as sizing of sewer force mains and gravity mains. So there is quite a bit of area out there, and this is kind of, we look at, not a worst case scenario, but we look at sizing these improvements kind of at a maximum density so that we don't run out of capacity in any of these lines. And so those ERTs, or equivalent residential taps, are basically the equivalent of one house for those different areas. Operational considerations I touched on briefly. The South Durango Sanitation District's boundary currently ends on the other side of the river. They would need to expand their district to serve this area. There is also another option that could be a sub-district could be formed that would operate the lift stations and collection system and pay a fee to South Durango for treatment. Both options are viable. I think the easier one would be to expand South Durango's boundary, but that'll be a future decision when this goes to construction. Funding options, you guys are probably tired of listening to me talk, so I will switch over to Andy Arnold, and he will go through some of these. Andy, if you just want to say next slide, and I'll scroll through them for you.
All right, thank you, Paul. Can you hear me okay? All right, great. So we had 5 funding strategies that we looked at to fund the sewer line. In all reality, this sewer line will be funded by a combination of these strategies. I don't want to give the impression that any one of them is going to be the end all be all for this. And like Paul said earlier, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, so feel free to ask some questions towards the end. Our first strategy is tax increment financing, otherwise known as TIF. It's a public-private partnership funding mechanism. It is used with urban renewal authorities in the state of Colorado. This takes future property taxes and sales tax revenue and allows it to be used upfront for development costs, such as infrastructure costs. Only incremental tax revenue can be used, and that means that whatever the development, as a development proceeds on a parcel, there's a base, and then as that development goes through, the value of that development is used for the upfront costs. It's sunset is 25 years. It can't go longer than 25 years when you create a TIF district, and it's very much performance based. The better a development performs, the more money it generates upfront, and it can close financing gaps. Paul, can you go to the next slide, please? Our other strategy is grant funding. This is a more traditional strategy that we're looking at. We found some great grants that can align very well with the La Posta sewer line that I think we have a compelling story that would make these grants realistic for being applied. One of them is the U.S. Economic Development Authority, otherwise known as the EDA. They have public works and economic adjustment assistance grants that can be tailored for infrastructure improvements that would generate businesses, jobs, and so forth. There's also community development block grants that are issued from the federal government but allocated through DOLA. That's the Department of Local Affairs in the state of Colorado. There's also a grant program called Build Discretionary Grants. That's building up infrastructure to leverage development. It's a U.S. Department of Transportation program that, again, aligns well with the La Posta sewer line. And then also Energy Mineral Impact Assistance Program. Now that's a state funded program. It's a grant that, once again, can be, I believe La Plata County aligns really well with this grant program. And so the La Posta sewer line could also align with it as well. Next slide, please. The other funding option is debt financing. This is typical. However, there are some federal agencies and state agencies that offer debt financing for infrastructure improvements with extremely long terms and really low rates that I think would work well. We see this as a great strategy for getting the sewer line funded. The first would be from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and they have a rural development loan program. The term of this loan is about 40 years, and its interest rate is 1.8%, and that's a fixed rate, so it's very low cost capital. The state's revolving loan fund, or the state's revolving fund, which is supplied by the Colorado Water Resources and Power Development Authority, is a similar loan to USDA's that also has very low rates. It could be as low as 0.5%, and its term is also 40 years. So again, two options for very low cost capital for infrastructure improvements. Next slide, please. So bonds, that's another typical way that we can generate revenue. There's two kinds of bond options that we see for the La Posta sewer line project. The first being revenue bonds. Tax revenues are used that are generated by a development are used to pay off what's called the debt service obligation on these bonds. Tax increment financing is typically a vehicle that you use to issue revenue bonds. The other one are general obligation bonds, and that's backed by the full faith of the municipality. These can be issued by the municipality. They tend to be funded through mill levies or a reallocation of a general fund, just the budget for whatever the municipality is doing. Next slide, please, Paul. And then finally, we were looking at opportunity zones. Opportunity zones are interesting because they're a new initiative from the federal government. They're allowing us to, they allow private investment to be targeted to communities for economic development. The most important thing about opportunity zones is that you have to be in a designated opportunity zone, which is designated by census tract. Fortunately for us, all of the La Posta Road area is in one of these opportunity zone census tracts. So it makes these projects eligible for funding. I should say that these projects, opportunity zone funding typically is for either a housing development or a business. Infrastructure is a little out of its purview, but there are ways to make it work for this sewer line project. Thank you for your time, everyone.
Thanks, Andy. Let's see. So kind of our next steps in this project after this will be to refine our cost estimates, get a little bit more detail on the lift station costs, power costs, associated costs of construction. Those are pretty high. So we want to fine tune those a little bit more before we finalize kind of the funding, not funding, the overall cost that would go into this report. We will be meeting with the committee, city, county, economic alliance staff to kind of review this meeting, review the questions that were brought up, and see what needs to be altered or changed before we move forward. And then we would kind of finalize our 30% design plans based on that, and then complete the summary report for this, which will sort of outlay the next steps in development in this area with the cost estimates, the funding options, kind of a roadmap to what the next steps are. And this report and plans would serve as a part of any kind of grant funding or finance applications. Before we go to questions or comments, Mike, Daniel, Vicky, Emily, anyone on the committee, do you guys want to bring up anything and or clarify anything that Andy and I might have glossed over?
Okay. This is Daniel from the county. I don't have anything to add, but I look forward to comments as they come up.
Thanks, Daniel. So I'm going to go into we did receive some questions ahead of time. So Emily added them to these slides. Emily, do you want to read these or you want me to read them? How did you want to do that?
Why don't you go ahead and read those and I'll monitor questions on the other side.
So this first one says laying a single larger sewer pipe on La Posta Road appears likely to provide the same functionality, but is simpler, less costly, and less disruptive environmentally versus laying duplicate sewer pipes on La Posta and on Kiva roads. Please explain why the second alternative is preferable. Note that all current residents of Adobe Cliffs and Deer Island are on county-approved septics. We agree with that statement. The alignment for that was not supposed to be on Kiva Road. I know at that scale, it appears that it is. It is supposed to be along the eastern property boundary of the parcel adjacent to Kiva Road. Sorry, give me 1 second. And so this parcel drains to the east, and so the thought is that some sort of development and or road system would be on this parcel, and this would be on the eastern edge of the parcel to capture gravity flows for this parcel and run them down, as well as the lower Isgar properties all drain to the river as well, and so the thought there is to put the trunk line at the lowest portion of the property. That's our thought. It isn't intended to actually be on Kiva Road, but adjacent to Kiva Road. And so some of these questions are kind of the same answer. We would not be going down Kiva Road. That's a private road. You guys own that and maintain that. We would be developing adjacent to it on that future parcel. And so I think that answer satisfies 2, 3, and 4 potentially. All these were related to that Kiva Road access. I'm going to kind of skip ahead and say that the sewer lines are intended to be near the property lines and at the bottom of the drainage path. However, we aren't intending to put them directly on Kiva Road, but to put them underneath a new road network on that vacant parcel. 6, during the Posta Road Area District Plan Worker meetings, we were assured by county and city representatives that Adobe Cliffs and Deer Island would be exempt from costs of construction and use for sewer and water. That is still true. The thought of this is that parcels and development that wants to participate in this, and this isn't even a proposal more than a plan forward, but private homeowners aren't being forced into anything. If you have a home and a septic and want to keep it that way, you can. The only caveat would be if redevelopment were to happen on those parcels in the future, that could change things slightly. The study has been referred to as a 30% design. What remaining work is required to make the study a 100% design? At what cost to complete? Typically, I talked with Mike Russell about this a little bit earlier. At this point, it's hard to say exactly, but a rule of thumb is 10% of construction costs at this point. So for each one of those phases, 10% of the construction costs would be for engineering, surveying, construction inspection, that kind of thing. Possible statistical variance for the current cost estimates. Currently, we have a 20% contingency in there. So I think the statistical variance would be approximately 20%. At this point, there are quite a few unknowns, and that's why we have that larger contingency in there. Assessment as to likely availability of grant funding. Andy or Mike, do you guys want to try to tackle that third question?
Yeah, I can jump in here, Paul. So it's a great question. I've I've had a lot of conversations with the EDA, the USDA, DOLA, and my impression is that there is a high likely availability of grant funding for projects such as this. I mean, first of all, the CARES Act has allocated billions of dollars, 9.8 specifically for USDA, 1.5 billion to the EDA, so that these grants can come out and they're targeted to rural areas focused on economic development. So this is something that this sewer line falls under that category. I think more importantly though, and it's something I said in the presentation, is that this grant, or if we do apply for grants on the Posta sewer line, it has a very compelling story because of the amount of development or businesses, industrial manufacturing uses that could come from it. And that's what these agencies are specifically looking for in a grant application. So yes, I think the assessment's a good one.
Andy, do you want to just tackle 4, 5, and 6 as they're kind of related to the financing? Can you see those?
Yep, I can see them. And
Okay.
Mike, feel free to jump in, and Paul, feel free to jump in if there's anything that you want to add. I guess question 4 is the handout materials reference public-private partnerships that have resulted in hundreds and billions of dollars of development. There's examples of TIFs in Colorado. How are public-private partnerships structured? How do they operate? How does this tie into the concept of funding gaps? So I guess first of all, public-private partnerships, are defined. I have this written down. U.S. Department of Transportation defines it as they are contractual agreements between a public agency and a private entity that allow for greater private participation in the delivery of projects. The Urban Land Institute broadens that. They call public-private partnerships creative alliances, and that's kind of how I see this. The commonality between it is that you're having, I believe that it's really boils down to the risk shared by a municipality and a private developer to get a project off the ground. And that's the important thing. I mean, there's examples of public-private partnerships all over. It's not a new idea. I mean, they actually started at the start of the country. There's the Lancaster Turnpike, the Erie Canal, the Transcontinental Railroad. Those are all P3s. But in terms of modern day examples, I pointed out the Denver REI. That's a public-private partnership where REI was incentivized by the city of Denver to move in, and it created a massive revitalization of the area. That was using tax increment financing. I believe the key thing with the concept of funding gaps is that we've seen La Posta Road area kind of be in a bit of a gridlock where the county and the city may not have the funds to extend this infrastructure improvement into this area, whereas also a developer over the last 20 years hasn't come along to shoulder that cost and extend it in there. And that's really where we see this cost is exorbitant, and it might require a cooperation between a municipality and a private developer to get it done. I hope that answers that question. Number 5, funding strategies right up. Public-private partnerships are between developers and municipalities. Does this mean sewer funding would derive solely from properties municipalities pursuing approved development projects without immediate funding participation coming from properties which are not pursuing development? I would say it depends on the structure of the public-private partnership. If this public-private partnership were to use something like tax increment financing, the funding for the sewer would come solely from the properties and the future development that would be included in that TIF district. If there was a different type of structure, it might include other properties, but it's unknown at this time. 6, what are the 11 separate factors for blight? This has to do with tax increment financing under the state of Colorado. Colorado has the Colorado revised statutes indicate 11 factors for blight that would need, 4 of the 11 would need to be found in an area for it to qualify for tax increment financing. Paul, I don't know if I don't want to go through them. They're kind of long. I guess the moral of the story is that the La Posta Road area would, we believe, hit around 4 or 5 of these factors. And let me just say, blight's a scary word. This is a legal term that comes from the 1950s and has stayed with us. It's not as nefarious as it seems on face value. And then 7, would the Southern Ute Indian Tribe assume a primary applicant role? This is assuming that they get a grant application or the primary applicant on this grant. Would they have control over the grant disbursements? Again, that depends on how the application is structured. If the Southern Ute Indian Tribe, I believe this is referencing a grant that is coming from the Economic Development Agency. It's an EAA grant, they call it. If there's some very favorable, there's some very favorable stipulations if a tribe is the primary applicant on these grants in terms of matching and the award amount. I would imagine that if the Southern Ute Indian Tribe was the primary applicant, they would have control over the grant disbursements, but it can be a partnership with the municipality as well, and that would change the disbursements. Paul, you want to jump in on number 8?
Yeah. Why is the property owned by 5 Carter shown as being serviced by phase 2A and 2B of the sewer system? It's a single family home site with no need for sewer service. And on the western side, the property acts as a privacy buffer between the home site and future development on the adjoining 97-acre property. Current alignment of Casey Lane accessing the home site may change in the future. So this is similar to the answer for the Kiva Road area. With the amount of vacant land on the 5 Carter, we felt it was necessary to assign some of that vacant land in the event that this property were to be purchased and subdivided, that the vacant area was served by those different phases. It was more for a capacity sizing exercise to see how much flow would be in those sewer lines. And then the ultimate alignment of that sewer line is still in flux. And then number 9, we got this just right before the meeting. Was wondering if any consideration has been given to making the river crossing for the sewer on a pedestrian bridge connecting the trail system of Rainbow Road in the South Valley. That has not been considered at this time, but that doesn't mean that it can't. I think currently it hasn't really been considered because it's all private property, but that could change in the future if some of these developments proceed and open spaces, dedicated things like that. There could be a pedestrian bridge down there, and that would be a good way to get the sewer flow across the river. So it has not been explored yet, but that doesn't mean it can't be in the future.
Okay, I'm gonna,
I think, yep, go ahead, Emily.
Roger Zelenoritis from the Southern Ute Indian Tribe. Roger, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Paul, hi, this is Roger. Could you go to the future phase that represents the tribal land, please? Thanks. Curious question here is as to why you proposed running the sewer line that far south.
That is the old Sky Ute gravel pit entrance.
Right.
And so based on discussions with Andy in that previous plan, I was under the impression that that was the connection point. Is it further north?
Well, yeah, I'm glad you have it on there because of exactly what you pointed out. It's a good location. But when we were originally talking with SEH, what we were looking at was further north where you see that road diverge to the west.
Yep.
And so maybe on the future phase, you could do, I might just propose maybe doing 2 costs, one being to that road that splits off to the north. On the north end, it splits off to the west, I'm sorry, and then then the cost that you have in there right now down to the location where you have it. I don't know if it'll make much of a difference, but at least we could evaluate it both then.
So Roger, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, part of it too is that is the south end or low end of the property where all the sewage would collect, and you'd collect it there and pump it all the way back up. So there's one thing is just to get the force main to the property, but the other thing is to actually serve the property, you need to put the lift station towards the bottom end of it.
Okay, so even if you put it further north, then eventually if you wanted to extend it south, you'd have to put a new lift station down on the south side. Is that
Correct. Or
Okay.
move it down there, yeah.
So that's an added cost in the future then. Okay,
Yes.
that helps. Thank you.
Yep. And Roger, we could prepare a little exhibit to show you what Andy had developed and kind of how it relates to this if you'd like later.
Yeah, I'd appreciate that. Thank you very much, Paul.
Okay, I have a question from David Tart. In regards to easements along the Deer Island properties, what does that entail?
I guess if it's, and so I apologize, I don't know all the properties by heart, but I believe these are the Deer Island properties. And so if we are crossing somebody's property, we would have to get an easement to put that infrastructure in. If we are to stay on this vacant property, I forget the ownership right now, then that would just be part of a kind of a development plan of water, sewer, roads, that kind of infrastructure. And so the intent would be to tie on, piggyback with those developments for this trunk line to go underneath their road system.
Okay, also he would like to know, would there be any cost to the property owner?
I don't know exactly which property it is, but if it's a private single family residence, I don't think so. There are different bonding funding mechanisms that could tax the entire area. I don't believe that that is the route that people want to go down. So I think the way that some of these funding options would work is that it would tax or bond the properties that are going to be developed and try as much as they can to leave people with single family homes and not interested in the development out of that.
Dave says it's phase 2, alternative 1.
So this option, if it were to require easements on both the Carter properties and the Jackrabbit properties, then we would have to get easements from both. In all likelihood, it would be a 20-foot easement, probably from the larger vacant Carter properties and not the single family homes along Jackrabbit.
Paul, I have another question regarding
Yep.
Deer Island. Please explain why the Deer Island boundary option A is better than B for phase 2. Is this a logistical route for a future road?
Could you say that again, Emily? I'm not following it.
So I would stay in phase 2.
Okay.
Can you please explain why the Deer Island boundary option A is better than option B for phase 2? Is this a logical route for a future road?
Yes. Okay. I believe it is. Yes. This alternative 2 for phase 2B is a road that would potentially serve both sides of those parcels, as well as functions better for gravity sewer. The area kind of adjacent to Jackrabbit properties is a pretty steep hill, and so more of the property could flow by gravity to here and utilize less sewer line than if it were to go down the property line.
Would a pedestrian bridge with sewer be less expensive?
I don't know. I'll have to look into that a little bit. I think the sewer portion might be less expensive, but then you've got to factor in the bridge component.
I was going to add too that in previous meetings when we did the land use plan with the county and the city, the pedestrian bridge concept was talked about. And if I recall, Vicky, that is not, nobody seemed to like that option to have a pedestrian bridge across the river at that location. So that could change in the future, but the original plans were developed without a pedestrian crossing or any kind of river trail along that river corridor.
Right, and Mike, also potentially with the timing, the crossing would need to be one of the first things installed to provide
Right.
service here, and so it could be a little bit of a pedestrian bridge to nowhere.
Don't need any of those.
If we had to put it in now, yeah.
Just to echo in on that, this is Vicky with the city planning. That's correct. We didn't have a lot of support when we were doing the area plan for pedestrian connections along the river. And, you know, that could change and that would change some of the dynamics. But right now there isn't any shown in our plan.
Okay. David Tart, again, would it not be better to have the lift station currently on Jackrabbit Trail on the oil pad closer to La Posta?
Potentially. The way the layout of the SCA-FAB property drains a little bit more to the east, I believe, and so that's why it's located there. However, depending on how much lower that is, it might make more sense to go next to that well pad as well.
Okay.
So we can look at that and provide a little bit better answer when we compare those grades.
Okay, so I did just get a document in that has a few questions on it. If I'm going to go ahead and read some of these. How much cheaper is the under river crossing than an aerial crossing for phase 1? How long can we anticipate it will take getting a 404 permit for the crossing after it is submitted?
I don't know. Those are some pretty tough questions. I don't know if an aerial crossing would work there. I know they've been done in the past, but with those grades, to get all the way up the riverbank and then all the way to the well pad, that would be a pretty big aerial crossing. And then the permitting, I don't want to guess at that. That can take, depends on the area a little bit, but it can take anywhere from a couple months to 6 months.
Okay. So I think with the document I just received, I think I need to send this out because there's going to be multiple people that need to weigh in on this, and it's going to take too much time at this point at the last minute. So we will report back to you, Mr. Wolf, with the answers to those questions. Next question is, have you considered or will you consider the geotech conditions in this area and cost impact? This area generally has a lot of rock, and more specifically, can you address the cost of the river crossing if these geo conditions are difficult to drill?
We haven't looked at geotech as part of this study. That's kind of one of the unknowns of why we have a larger contingency in there. As far as the river crossing, that would also kind of eat into the contingency. If it's a more difficult crossing than typical, it could be slightly more expensive.
Okay, next question. Regarding near Kiva Road placement of the sewer line, still unclear why a single larger sewer line on La Posta Road would not be less costly.
La Posta Road's higher than that parcel adjacent to Kiva Road. And so we always try to put sewer trunk lines at the lowest point on a property because, kind of like drainage, sewer needs to go to that lowest point. Otherwise, you're fighting grade and it becomes deeper, more expensive, and you might not be able to serve the entire property. That being said, it is always cheaper to put in one sewer line than two. However, we want to put the one sewer line at the lower end of the property, and that's why it's there at this time.
If you have the lift stations on the oil pad, the grade issue becomes different, right? Question mark.
Yes, the grade issue would be different if we were to move the tie-in for 2B to the west along that oil pad. It might be higher than it currently is.
Would a pedestrian bridge eliminate a forced main and use gravity?
It could. It depends on kind of the grades of that pedestrian bridge. The issue with that would be you might lose some of, if it were to flow by gravity from here all the way across, that would mean that we couldn't serve this property because the sewer line would be kind of starting at grade along the ground. And so we would have to push development further away from it. There's a potential, but typically it would be pumped.
Okay, will I have any more questions coming in? Any comments that people would like to make? I could unmute you if you'd like to talk. Anyone? Paul, can you go back to the end of the PowerPoint? I would
This
like to
one?
remind you all that this is the list of contacts for this project. This will be on the Yes LPC website, and you'll be able to view it there. Hold on, I had something come in. Oh, DML said, thank you, everyone. This was helpful. And then the last slide, Paul. If you have any questions or comments that you did not get put in today or you think about after this presentation, feel free to email them to Emily at Yes LPC and I will distribute them accordingly. Are there any other comments from anyone?
Emily, can you hear me? This is Bob.
Yes, it is. Hi, Bob.
I've got 2 pages of questions and some observations. Would you like me to read them now, or you guys just want to get back to me?
Paul, that's up to you.
I don't have his email address, so I didn't send them to him. I just sent them to Vicky and Daniel.
They can pass them on. Bob, if they're quick and you want to go through them, that's fine. Or we could talk offline too.
You
Up to
might
you.
want to do that. It won't be quick.
Okay.
Okay, we'll take that offline. Thank you, Bob. Anyone else? Folks, I thank you for your time today. And as I said, you can find all this recording and information on yeslpc.com. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.